This has to do directly with your reading and selections from statements and the 1943 article, The Role of Language in Perceptual Process. So you've got those two pieces of writing, and this is your assignment to pick 10. Let's see how we have it formulated here. Of the most, pick the 10 most vivid, illuminating statements that Brzezinski makes in these writings. Most helpful in grasping something significant and leaving out some points about general semantics. And explain for each statement, you write a little commentary explaining how it did that. So basically, you're selecting 10 statements and writing commentary about each of those statements. How it is that you found it helpful in grasping something significant. We're approaching the devices of general semantics. I'm going to take this off for indulgence. I've already said a little bit about most, if not all, of these. So I'm going to talk about all of them. I'll introduce them all in a group, and then we'll proceed to devote a little bit of time to each of them seriatim, so one after another, or in a series. So we've got the index, the date, chain index. These really go together in a way that doesn't quite apply to the remaining devices. Then there's the etc. And then there's a couple of devices that are aimed at elementalism, and they are quotes and hyphens. Quotes and hyphens. Now, ideally, one is working with the structural differential and with the devices. Working with the structural differential sort of orients you towards the devices and vice versa. They sort of potentiate and reinforce one. In work with a structural differential, for example, or I should say also maybe that this group of three sort of points us towards the object level. Now what do we find at the object level? We find singularity. That's the index. We find historicity. I could choose other words here. And we find contextuality. So let's take, for example, the tree. Remember the tree that we talked about? Potter's tree. So the index points us to this tree. The index goes like this. Tree 1. So Brzezinski says at the object level, every whatever could have its own name. And here's how he gives it its own name, the mathematical notation, the index. Tree 1 is not the same as tree 2, etc. Let's say we could consider all the trees in the world. That would take us to the nth. Tree 1 is not the same as tree 2, etc. Hey, we can go up levels also. Let's say forest. This forest here, this forest around us, is not the same as another forest. So, all the forests in the world.
But I thought that if you'd seen one redwood, you'd seen them all.
That's right. Well, he didn't really think that. He was looking at the bottom line, which is, of course, what often happens to divert us from the object of where we live. And, you know, if I had another example, I could take it further up to higher levels of abstraction. So the index is useful at all levels of abstraction. And of course, this tree that we're talking about would be this tree now. That's the date. This tree now. November the 3rd, in the Common Era 2010. 4:15. And this tree now contains within itself its entire history. There's no such thing as this tree now devoid of its history. This tree now contains its entire history, how far back do you want to go? And it also perhaps in some sense contains within itself its future. Okay? So ultimately from the Big Bang to the supernova. And the chain index, it's this tree now, which I can now abbreviate as TTN in its context. Whatever that means. So the chain index puts whatever in its context or contexts. Because seldom does a thing inhabit just one context. And of course, if you want to push that all the way, you get contexts of the contexts, and then the context of the contexts of the contexts. All the way to the context of all contexts. Otherwise known as God. I just wanted to show you how broad these horizons can be. You can see that in working with the devices, you have to use your common sense. It doesn't liberate you from the necessity of using your common sense, whatever that may be. And of course, that depends a lot on context. So the use of the devices themselves, let's say, use of the devices in context A is not the same. It's not going to be the same as use of the devices in context B, and so on. The structural differential has directed you to look for singularity, to notice singularity and historicity, and also contextuality. And if you pay attention at the object level, then according to the structural differential, this is what you'll find, among other things. Individuality or singularity, historicity, and contextuality. and the etc. I've already used it a few times in this presentation as far as it's gone. There's always more to say. In other words, one has never said all about whatever. One has never said all about whatever. There's always more to say. So that's what Kosinski calls the principle of non-allness. And even when one has said, again pushing it to the ultimate, even when one has said everything that could possibly be said about whatever, one has not exhausted the phenomenon. In other words, or whatever. I'll just keep saying whatever. One has not exhausted whatever. Because even if you said all that could possibly be said about whatever, much if not most of whatever could never be said, could never be put into words, could never be contained within a concept or a set of concepts. And since I just used that expression, some of you are perhaps students of critical theory, and specifically of Theodore Adorno's critical theory. And something that is constantly being quoted from Adorno is that no thing goes into its context without remainder, or something like that. Somebody give me a more exact quote. So I once read, and then I forgot where, and I haven't been able to track down the reference, so if anyone can supply it for me, that would be good too. I once read a book about Adorno in which the author opines at one moment that it's almost as if Adorno wants to provide us with an asterisk which could go with any concept or conceptualization to remind us that concepts, inevitable and useful and indispensable though they may be, can never contain all of that to which they purportedly refer. Okay. Now this here, we got 6 different kinds of asterisks. So if Adorno had known about general semantics, and if he could have got past his objections and distaste for general semantics, he might perhaps at least have approved of this little bit of public education. There's 6 different forms of asterisk, which he calls the devices of general. We could talk about fascism. I came across a book about 2-3 years ago when I was doing my research. There's something else I wanted to say. And sometimes in this course, if I have time, I assign a task. The essay that I assigned today is one possibility, but another possibility for an essay task that I'm not going to use this year. I assign a task of choosing 2-3 excerpts from discourse, whatever, books, editorials, rants, critiquing them using the devices of general semantics above the bar, and below the bar showing how you're using the devices of general semantics in the critique. Just for example, okay? This I picked up out of a little bit of discourse the other day, and it was something like this. Okay? It was something like, Jews are 40 times more likely than non-Jews to be among the top 400 wealthy persons in the world according to Forbes magazine. Now this is an example. Tell me what is an example of. I'm going to be giving you the task of finding examples and discussing them of the use or non-use of the devices in discourse. So this is an example of the non-use of what device? If you have to think about it, it's okay. You haven't internalized it yet. It's non-use of the index, okay? Because Jew1 is not the same as Jew2 all the way to the end. And this statement is telling us, for example, that I, being Jewish, am 40 times more likely than you to belong to the top 400 according to Forbes magazine. But I assure you, I'm not at all any more likely, I am not at all any more likely to belong to the top 400 than you are. Or indeed the German Shepherd walking down St. George at this moment. So it's an example of the non-use of the index, one that passes by in discourse usually without comment. Take a certain group, make a statement based on a statistical analysis about the group, like Jews or a Jew or any given Jew. Or for example, blacks are 13% more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system than whites or Asians. It's another example of the non-use of the index. Because this particular wizened, weak, bespectacled, old black woman is no more likely, is probably less likely to be involved in a crime of violence than me, for example. Okay? So the statements about the group, Jews or blacks, or any given Jew or any given black, or a Jew or a black, they're all examples of the non-use of the index that is so common in discourse that it passes unnoticed, in my opinion. Or if it doesn't pass unnoticed, people can't quite grapple with it without getting all excited and emotional and dragging in and talk about racism and stuff like that, which is not irrelevant. But right now, all we have to say is that a higher proportion of Jews are very wealthy than of any other group, at least according to the Forbes survey. So that lets me in, because I'm not part of that higher proportion. The statement doesn't apply to me. It can't apply to me. The statement about Jews tells you absolutely nothing about Horowitz. Nothing. Okay, you can learn and study about Jews, or even if you want to get a little trickier, Zionists, all day long. And I won't tell you a goddamn thing about Horowitz. It's a non-use of the index. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could give an example of the non-use of the date.
Oh, we're going to give
Oh,
lots of
we're
examples for the next 4 or 5 classes.
Oh, okay.
So that essay task I was telling you about. So if you were doing that essay, if you're writing that essay, you would use this language, this technical language of general semantics below the bar. That's just for other people who know about general semantics. Okay, because this is an esoteric teaching. It's a secret teaching. And I'll tell you why. And above the bar, you would deliver the same message, but without mentioning Korzybski, general semantics, Horowitz, the devices, the structure of the potential, or anything like that. Why? Because you want to be able to get this message across without necessarily involving people in a discussion of whether they've heard of general semantics or whether they like it or whether they'll buy it, and why on earth you're trying to sell them something that they haven't already bought. Because people, especially in academia, do not like to hear about anything that you think is important that they don't already know about. As you may or may not have discovered. So don't discuss Well, if you do discuss what's happening in this course with others, if you've done it, then you've probably already run into a little bit of trouble. Yeah. So the Straussians were onto something when they wrote, or Leo anyway, when he wrote Persecution and the Art of Writing, because persecution comes in the strangest and most unexpected and bizarre form. Unintended persecution. If I were writing, for example, a paper about Adorno, it might be illuminated by my acquaintance with general semantics and devices, but I wouldn't mention them in the paper. I would just say, because we're looking for trouble. We want to help people, not confuse or hurt them. No, unless in a particular, that's context. Unless in a particular context, you decide, having used your common sense, that it would be useful to introduce people to the esoteric teaching, then you go ahead and do so. So I might write, say, that this guy who brings up the idea of the asterisk, I might write, yeah, that's a very interesting thing to say about Adorno, and we could go further than that and say that he would have welcomed perhaps many asterisks, perhaps as many as 5 or 6, because there's all kinds of different ways in which whatever is not going to be contained within the concept. Of course, usually they're all happening simultaneously. I mean, you could already see, because I was talking about the tree. You can't say the index applies, but the date and chain index don't. So in fact, I would say in almost every situation in relation to whatever, all of the devices would apply. But which ones you choose to use would depend on context. And which ones you would choose to focus on would depend on context. I'm speaking very generally and abstractly now, although I am giving some details. And the idea is, again, that with practice, it's intended to become automatic. One of the paradoxes of this kind of training, too, because here, a kind of heightening of consciousness depends at the same time on a certain kind of heightening of automaticity. Happen. So I came across this book when I was doing research on fascism. I was doing research about fascism in Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, and I thought, oh, fascism. Let's look into it. Well, the harder you try to find something, the more elusive it becomes. Never did find fascism. I found that British fascism, French fascism, Italian fascism, and German fascism are very, very different from one another, actually, although they were all fascism. And then, of course, there are boundary phenomena. You can't decide whether to classify something as fascism or not. But given that we've got some kind of a general definition of fascism, then within that general definition, there are all these extremely interesting differences. And then I picked up this book called Fascism in Ferrara by Paul Connor. Now, who ever heard of Ferrara? If you've got any connection with Italy, you've heard of Ferrara, because it's a region in Italy. I don't think I'd heard of it before picking up this book. A whole book on fascism in Ferrara by Paul Connor. And in the introduction he writes, the fascist movement differed greatly from region to region in Italy. So within Italy, a proliferation of fascisms. The fascism of Ferrara was not that of Milan, much less of Palermo or Catania. Fascism in the agricultural areas was quite different from that of the industrial areas, the large and small towns, the north, the south, and the islands. And he writes, effective comparison becomes very difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. So he's not giving up on the task of comparison. That is, looking for the common as well as for the different. How many exam questions have you written up to begin with compare and contrast? Compare is to find similarities and contrast is to find differences. Makes it more difficult, so the devices are intended to make it more difficult. hey, lives are hanging in balance here. Shouldn't it become more difficult? Before you go out to kill the fascists, you should know more about the differences among them, or the Taliban, or the Zionists, whatever. The Aristotelian orientation prefers to ignore the difficulty. So Connor here is using the index and the chain index a lot, without knowing about general semantics or the devices. If he had known about the devices, his work would have been even more difficult. Because with the date, we find that fascism 1923, I'm talking now about Italian fascism, 1923 is very different from fascism 1940. Very different. 1923 fascism was a revolutionary movement that had a powerful critique of capitalism. Fascism 1943 is like gone, sort of swallowed by, more or less swallowed by Hitler by 1940. Mussolini had already sent his Jewish lover away. Did you know Mussolini had a Jewish lover?
Or that he accepted Jewish refugees.
At some point.
Yes.
That was made Jewish. Politics requires swift reversals, of course. Then there's the chain index. Well, you can see how that's directly relevant to the date here. Fascism in opposition is very different from fascism in government. So these are what Korzybski calls extensional devices. We've already talked about the extensional orientation. These are called extensional devices because they facilitate the extensional orientation. They direct your attention towards the object level. They help to induce that fraction of a second of psychological delay so that you don't identify Horowitz with Jew or whatever. So that you immediately don't identify the object with the label under which it is subsumed, or the lower abstraction with the higher abstraction under which it is subsumed, and so weiter. And then there's the etc., which is used so often in Korzybski text that he gets tired of writing it out and abbreviates it like this. So when you find this in Korzybski text, that a comma, or is it a period followed by a comma? I always forget. Those. He writes that instead of etc. And of course, you know the journal is called etc. No matter how many ways of classifying whatever you can imagine, there can always be more ways of classifying that very phenomenon. And even the most extensive set of classifications conceivable cannot contain all of whatever. So the etc. points to the ultimate inconceivability of this now in context. So we'd have to say Italy, for example, was fascist, etc. We'd have to say Mussolini was fascist, etc. We'd have to say Charles Manson was a serial killer, etc. We'd have to say Roman Polanski was a rapist, etc. 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 Notice that the extensional devices do not abolish the category. It's still there doing its thing in the structural differential. We haven't got rid of the category tree. When we index the tree, we were taking full account simultaneously of its identity, if you like, in some sense, with all other trees, and its difference, with one simple little gesture. The devices 5, 6 little gestures reform the language. I mean, they would go some distance to reforming the language just on their own. When you're working with them and with the structural differential and silent practice all together, you've got a reform of the language in the deepest sense, or at least in a very deep sense, a reform of the language, making it less Aristotelian and more non-Aristotelian, so that the structure of the language becomes more similar in structure to what is going on. Because, at least according to our highest label level now, what is going on, the event is not the object, is not the label. But our language identifies event, object, and label. And with these devices, we blow that identity, we produce non-identity. We've got a language that recognizes that the event is not the object, is not the label, the lower abstraction is not the higher abstraction, and so weiter. So although it's true in some sense that there's a difficulty with language per se, and the more profound the philosopher is, the more convinced he is that language is an insuperable obstacle, some of them will admit that you can use language to critique language, but usually when they use language to critique language, they're making things really, really difficult so that it could be understood maybe only after 3 years of heavy labor in graduate school. And here, Korzybski is producing something that you can sell in great form. And then we've got the quotes and hyphens, which Korzybski calls safety devices. So we've got the extensional devices, index, date, chain index, and etc. And then you've got these two, which are kind of alternates, which you call safety devices. They protect us from elementalism, which I've already talked about a little bit. So, staying with the example of fascism, if I put fascism in quotes, I'm saying, hey, there is no inherently existing fascism that comes out of the blue and exists in and of itself, containing its existence within itself. Fascism is related to, let me just say it baldly for a moment and then get even more radical, there is no fascism that is not inextricably related with such things as underdevelopment, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all countries in which fascism arose were not only economically underdeveloped, but were extremely aware of this. And in fact, Mussolini described Italy as a proletarian nation. The Italian fascists decided that the class struggle was to be conducted by nations rather than by classes. That was a little step that Mussolini took from internationalist socialism to national socialism. Underdevelopment, imperialism, capitalism. Mussolini decided they have empires, why doesn't Italy have an empire? So he went out to get Libya, Ethiopia, and maybe Catholicism. Because all the countries in which fascism flourished were also, if not predominantly Catholic, substantially Catholic. I think maybe one reason that fascism, among many, never really got off the ground in Britain. And there are many reasons, but among them maybe was the strength of Protestantism in Britain. And we know that in Germany, fascism was strongest in the Catholic South in Bavaria. So the devices, you could put it this way, also bring the is not. Like if the map is not the territory, the devices bring the is not directly into the language. So, you know, maybe it's not fair to the language to try and bring it down maybe it's not fair to the Goliath of language to try and bring it down with this little pebble and a slingshot of general semantics. I don't know how far I want to push that back. So that concludes the first run through. Now I'm going to spend some more time talking about each one at a time. See, I believe in the importance and usefulness of repetition. Repeat it, then you say it again in a slightly different way, say it again in a slightly different way, say it again in a slightly different way. It's good for learning, but we also need time for repetition. We don't have time. Okay, so here's a little quote from Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary theorist. This is from his book called Full House, 1996. It's just a snippet from Gould to cast a little bit of light on the index, because that's what we're talking about now. Darwin's revolution should be epitomized as a substitution of variation for essence as the central category of natural reality. Variation, difference, comes to the forefront, shoving out essence, the idea of inherent, self-existing, substantial essences of things, as the central category of natural reality. And Gould says, what can be more discombobulating than a full inversion or grand flip in our concept of reality? In Plato's world, variation is accidental, while essences record a higher reality. In Darwin's reversal, we value variations as defining reality, and our closest approach to essence now becomes an operational approach in terms of averages, which we recognize as mental abstractions. So, back to what I was saying before about blacks and Jews, there is no, what the Nazis called Rassenseele, there is no racial soul or essence of the Jew that makes him better with money. It's a statistical truth. And the great thing about statistical truths is that it's, somewhere at the label levels. So, Jews, let's say, let's get rid of that. Let's use a non-Aristotelian relation. Let's say a higher proportion of Jews are wealthy. Oh yes, and that had something to do with fascism too, not in Italy, but in other places. You know what the first thing Hitler did when he came to power was? First. Maybe not the first, but among the very first things he did, expropriate the big Jewish department stores in Berlin, clearing the way for the small Aryan stores, which had been sort of pushed to the shadows by Jews. And here we have, at the object level, so what is true of the group is not true at the object level. So, hey, we can use the index here too. Truth 1 is not the same as truth 2. What's true at one level is not true at another. So much for truth. Notice we haven't abolished truth. We haven't said there is no truth. We haven't said that. Anyone who said that, anyone who says that, will very quickly find himself in boiling oil. Stupid thing to say. There is no truth. So anyone who says it, if they're not stupid, you gotta ask them, what do you mean by that? And then here's a discussion. And here's a Marxist footnote. Money is the highest and most general and most abstract category in capitalist societies. You could call money the anti-index. Benjamin Franklin said, time is money. Time, that is the actual activities of human beings at the object level where they live, are subordinated to what these activities all have in common insofar as they are universally exchangeable. That is in terms of money. Or as Hobbes said, the value of a man is his price, or that is what others will pay for his services. And if you've been reading the Toronto Star the last few days, you may have noticed the great social scientific discovery of the fact that a little child who can delay reaching for a marshmallow for 15 minutes is going to be more successful in life than the child who can't control his desire for his marshmallow and reaches out for it right away. Did you see that story? Well, there's no devices are happening on that list, right? For example, I don't know which would be most appropriate, the chain index here. What about the context in which you know there's always going to be a lot of marshmallows, so there's no point in waiting?
What if they starve the child all day before the experiment?
That'll teach them. So, on this Marxist footnote, and also I was talking about before about damaged life, the way that the intentional orientation is damaging to life. This is one of the ways in which it's damaging to life. From the Marxist point of view, that human experience is become interchangeable. They all, to the extent that they all get priced or commodified, that they can be sold and bought, they all become kind of interchangeable. They lose their specificity. They lose what Marx called their use value. They become subsumed under exchange value. One of my criteria, as you noticed in the task assignment, was vivid. If it's vivid, hey, I like it, don't you? When I was a lad of 7 in Calgary in the 40s, World War II was going on, our neighbor's house all of a sudden one day was vacant and padlocked, and the grass started growing in the yard. And after a few weeks, I asked my father what happened there, and my father said that people who lived there were German-speaking Swiss. But they were German, and there was a war going on against Germany. Things became very uncomfortable for them. I don't know, in that neighborhood, in Calgary, in Canada, in the West, they had to take off. So, non-use of the index. Now, what if they hadn't been Swiss? What if they'd been from Bavaria? And they had to leave. Just the same problem. Why did it take me 15 years to think of saying that just now? You know what is really weird? German Jewish refugees were interned in Canada during World War II because they were Germans. Did you know that? It seems hard to imagine. German Jewish refugees, for example, a man I knew named Gregory Baum, who converted to Roman Catholicism when he was 16. But the Nazis considered him a Jew because he was born Jewish. He came to Canada as a refugee. And the Canadian government, our government, we interned him because he was German. Now, maybe not completely irrational, because maybe we thought that the Germans could have tried to introduce spies into our country disguised as Jews or something like that, but I don't think so. The non-use of the index is so powerful in politics that probably if the index took power, politics would grind to a halt. Imagine all power to the index. Politics would grind to a halt. The index can be recognized and its significance denied. It's a very important part of political discourse. People go, yeah, I know, we shouldn't generalize. Blah, blah. And they go on. All you got to do is say, yeah, I know, I shouldn't generalize, and then you can go on and do it any way you want. How many of you have seen the film The Remains of the Day with Anthony Hopkins playing the butler? And he wonders why his aristocratic employer is in England, and his employer is an English aristocrat. I stopped saying British. Started saying English. His employer is an English aristocrat. See, British one is not the same as British two. It's the United Kingdom, etc. So he wonders why his fascist aristocrat employer insists on dismissing two very young likable, hardworking Jewish servant girl. 15-year-old servant girls in the aristocrat's castle. And he dismisses them. He fires them. They're off to London without any economic prospects. And the butler can't figure out how his employer could do such a thing. And then he realizes, hey, the Lord Ha-Ha, or whatever his name was, knows a lot more about the Jewish problem than I do. End of concern. Somebody knows more about the whatever problem than I do. That's the structure of difference. Somebody knows more than I do. And it's true, his employer did know a lot more about the Jewish problem than he did. Of course, the dogs always get to us. The frou-frou about let's call it racializing pit bulls a while back. The pit bull became an illegal dog. There was a big controversy about that. So the Star can't avoid the opportunity to get all sentimental and mushy about its favorite issues. But look at that, like the object of it. There it is. Pit Bull 1 is not the same as Pit Bull 2, but the legislation doesn't recognize that. I'm not going to get into the controversy. It's just the fact that the legislation does not recognize the vast differences among pit bulls, especially in terms of the contexts in which they are raised and owned, etc. Pit Bull 1 is not the same as Pit Bull 2. Task. I'm going to give more examples before the task. Here's an example. This is from an exchange in Now magazine a few years back. Somebody writes in Now magazine, in India, female children are considered the property of their parents. It's in one issue. And then in the next issue, someone writes back, wow, talk about defining 1 billion people with 11 words. So there's non-use and use here. You know, the term community, whenever you see the term community, you should reach for your index. The Jewish community, the Black community, the Jamaican community, the business community, the biker community. Whenever you see the community as in the Muslim community or whatever, the index should kick in. Which Muslim community specifically? So a few further down, which sub-community of which Muslim community specifically, and then all the way down to which Muslim specifically, and maybe even further down, which Muslim in which mood on what day specifically. If I was a Muslim, if I were a Muslim, I would have many moods. Canadians are more attached to their provinces than to Canada as a whole, it says here. Well, for one thing, it's not true of Ontario. Even the pollsters will tell us that. So let's take Ontario out of the equation. But even then, we still have a problem. So if you've internalized the index, it's automatic. The minute you hear the word Canadians, you ask, well, which Canadians? And it happens that fast. You don't have to answer the question, you just have to raise it. Which provinces specifically, and what about attachment? Canadians are more attached to their provinces than to Canada as a whole. This is social science, you know, you go to a doorstep and you say, are you more attached to your province or Canada as a whole? And I'll say, Canada, province. You know, what is attachment? Is attachment 1 the same as attachment 2, the same as attachment 3, the same as attachment 4? I don't think so. Just raising the question. Then to conclude the discussion of the index, and then I'll assign you the task, and then I'll ask myself, did I really think I could get through the first 3 today? It's also important to not forget that the index, although it's directing our attention to the specific, let's say, it's directing our attention to the specific. does not leave the general behind. Far from it. It brings them into a saner relation. So this means that, again, depending on context, at times you may want to emphasize the general rather than specific. For example, I use these terms loosely and without attachment. If the class enemy, for example, is emphasizing specificity, I might get suspicious. What benefit is it to the ruling class to be emphasizing specificity at this moment in time? But as, for example, well, not all capitalists are thieves. Right? That's a use of the index. It's pointing to the specific moral differences among different grades of capitalists with different qualities of morality. And anyway, we catch the bad ones and we put them in jail. Conrad Black is in jail. You can breathe easy. It's the good capitalists who are running the show now, okay? I've got a much juicier index here, example here having to do with racism, but I'm going to skip it. And somewhere in Science Sanity, Korzybski says something like that. He even quotes some English philosopher of the 17th century, a woman, in fact. I forget her name. It's in here somewhere. We don't have time to look it up. Who advises people to look for the different in the similar and to look for the similar in the different. So you can actually do that with full respect for both similarity and difference. Korzybski says in our Aristotelian civilizations, we privilege similarity and we ignore difference. So he wants to restore the balance, but that doesn't mean you forget about similarity. A tree is a tree. A Jew is a Jew. A woman, though. What is a woman? That's a different question. So here's a task. And what does she want? What does she want? I'm just assuming everybody can pick up on these references. Some people might think that I'm making this up here, but I'm quoting Sigmund Freud. And if he couldn't figure it out, we could. All those teenagers on the couch, year after year after year, he still couldn't figure out what was going on. So here's the index task. So for each of the devices I assign a task. In this original version of the task, I'm asking for 10. Today, since you're privileged with the half-year version of half the course, we'll give you 5. So what you do is you find 5 examples of the use or non-use of the index you might think this is simple. It is, you can make it simple, but then you will not have learned much. And over the years, I've identified the main forms of oversimplifying the response to this task, and I've concocted these 2 pages of handout titled the Horowitz model for indexing, which will be quite incomprehensible to you at first glance, but I'm going to take you through them. The Horowitz model for indexing. Let's say you come across a statement that refers to Christians or Christianity. Okay? And now the statements that you're looking for should be, they shouldn't be too brief and they shouldn't be too long either. You might ask me, what is too brief or too long? And I can't answer that. But if we're just focusing on Christians, you might think that what I'm looking for is a simple two-value distinction. Like, for example, hey, you can't talk about Christians in general because Christians could be either liberal or fundamentalist. Well, that's not enough. In fact, that's almost worse than any non-indexing at all. It's an example of what Korzybski calls a two-valued orientation. As if there's just 2 kinds of Christians, fundamentalists and liberals. Oh no, there's many more kinds of Christian than that. I'm going to show you. I've lived long enough to meet more different kinds of Christians than you could shake a stick at. Or Jews, you know. Anti-Semites have always said, I'm not opposed to all Jews. I'm opposed to Jews who do evil. But some of my best friends are Jews. Those are Jews who do good. Today that would be the distinction between Zionists and non-Zionists. That's one of the more common forms that this distinction is taken in relation to Jews. As if there weren't 100 different kinds of Zionists, and different kinds of non-Zionists, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, better would be somehow to get something approaching the full gamut in there, okay? Let's say Christianity. Christianity 1 is not, see, the example I gave stopped at two values. Christian 1 is not the same as Christian 2, but we've got to take it further than that. Christianity 1 is not the same as Christianity 2, is not the same as Christianity 3, is not the same as, take it to the nth. Why, just the other day, the Pope opened up a whole new kind of Christianity, like a subset of Roman Catholicism for Anglicans who wanted to get away from the liberals and the Episcopalian confession. You notice that? Is there an Episcopalian or an Anglican in the house? If there were, you would have noticed it, because now you'd be struggling with the temptation to go over to the Pope from a church that was based on opposition to the papacy and popery. In other words, you're going for what Korzybski called the many-value orientation rather than the two-value orientation. Even closer to the object level, Christian individuals. Christian 1 is not the same as Christian 2. Many different, unique individuals could be classified as Christians. You've got, I know this, don't ask me how I know it. You've got in your mind some stereotypes of conservative Christians that are just horrendous. If you get to meet any or get closer to the object level. Why, I once met a middle-aged woman from Texas who was a very nice, progressive-minded person in every respect. I'm astonished to hear that she was not only a Southern Baptist, but an official in a Southern Baptist organization in her state, which was, of all places, Texas. Well, the statement you are looking at in your task might not need indexing if it simply has to do with what all Christians have in common. So you could ask yourself, well, what do all Christians and all Christianities have in common? You could say belief in the special mission of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm very careful there I don't say belief in Jesus as Messiah or as a Son of God, because some Christians don't believe in Jesus as Messiah or as Son of God, or even in the divinity of Jesus. They just believe in a special mission of Jesus, like I'll bet Unitarians and Universalists might go for the special mission of Jesus.
A growing wing of the United Church of Canada as well, actually.
Is that a fact?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you could say all Christians believe in the special mission of Jesus of Nazareth. And if you wanted to challenge that, I would accuse you of triviality. Okay? So in doing these tasks, the first commandment is don't be trivial. Don't commit the sin of triviality. What do I mean? Don't give me something that is so obvious that you don't need general semantics. You know, when I was 8 years old, one of my little schoolmates told me that a Jew had killed Christ, and I was like, what? I ran home to my mother and said, is it true, is it true? She said, nope, that was it. No long discussion.
So how do we avoid triviality in this?
Well,
like if everything is not
the whole purpose of what I'm doing now is to help you to avoid triviality. For example, well, or let me finish and then we can come back to it, which is a good one, but it's something like trying to prove a negative. I'd rather tell you how to not be trivial. I guess it amounts to the same thing. Okay, simply giving, this is based on tasks I've got over the years. So I can't give the feedback to those who have committed this sin before. I can give it to you based on the statistical generalization that this group of students in the spirit course is similar enough to past groups that I can give them this information without ignoring the date. If you simply give me detailed information about a particular unique person or situation or whatever, like for example, a few years ago, every few years there's a ruckus in the press about violence in Toronto high schools. And no matter what we do, there's violence in Toronto high schools. And often it's like that, violence in the schools. Need to put police in the schools. Need more police in the schools. Need to lock them up and throw away the key. Need to bring back corporal punishment, etc., etc. I exaggerate. So if you are writing the task and you're using an example of such a story, then you might think that if you say, well, Malcolm X school in Rosedale, I think there's a Malcolm X school in Rosedale, I don't think so.
There will be.
Malcolm X school in Rosedale has not had a single incident of violence in its entire history as a school. That's okay, but it's not a use of the index. It's more like E prime, if you remember E prime way back at the beginning. I mean, you are getting closer to the object level, but you're not insisting on difference. A statement uses the index. This is what I'm saying here on page 2 of the Horowitz model, index hints. The statement uses the index, and I've got 3 marks like this beside it. A statement uses the index only if it explicitly states that, for example, Toronto schools are of many varieties. So when you write up the task, be sure to explain how the statement uses or does not use the index. So if you do that, you're going to avoid triviality. Because in explaining how the statement uses or does not use the index, it'll be clear that if it's really obvious, then it's trivial. For example, I went out to the park, well, it's not an example of the index, it's an example of the etc. But on the issue of triviality, it might be helpful. So let's say the task is on the etc., there will be one. And you write, I went out into the park here, you find an example of the use of the etc., and you say, this is the example. I went out into the park the other day, and it was full of dogs. Poodles, shepherds, pit bulls, labs, St. Bernards, Pekingese, Chihuahuas. It's not a use, I mean it is a use of the etc., but it's trivial. Because, you know, so what? If you can go so what, it's kind of trivial. If it was about pit bulls, maybe it wouldn't be trivial, because let's put it this way, if it's enhancing our sanity, it's not trivial. It's capable of enhancing our sanity. Now, if this was grade 3, maybe that whole list of different breeds would be okay. I was asking the little 9-year-olds. You explain how the text statement uses or does not use the index. For example, compare. This is at the end of page 3 here. Compare. Let's say you're dealing with a little bit of anti-immigrant discourse. And if you want to find anti-immigrant discourse, there's a website called vbear.com, which is an American site mostly devoted to war on Mexicans, Mexican illegal immigration. And they're full of information for you about what Mexicans are likely or not likely to do. Yes. But here's just one example. Let's say you want to subject such a discourse to the index, and you come up with this. This particular Mexican immigrant, Jose, speaks English very well, and 5 other languages fairly well, and participates in many local organizations. All right, so you are talking about one specific Mexican, Jose, but it's not quite the use of the index that I'm looking for. What would be an example of the kind of use of the index that I'm looking for? Mexican immigrants, you'd have to also say something like this. Mexican immigrants span the gamut of degrees of knowledge of English and involvement in local activities. VDare.com wants you to think that they're involved in a reconquista, a reconquest of New Mexico, California, and Texas, which were taken by the United States from Mexico in a war, the Mexican-American War, in case you didn't know that. So there are some Mexicans who think maybe they should go back to, Mexico should take it back. And this surge of Mexican immigrants in the United States, especially the southwestern states, is part of a plan to Mexicanize those American states. Proof of that is they don't learn English, they're dirty, and criminal, poverty, they're burden the welfare system. And all that. Look, you know that 80% of the prisoners in Manitoba are Aboriginals. That means a higher proportion of Aboriginals are involved in the criminal justice system in Manitoba than of other groups. So if I write, Sandra Lerone lives in Winnipeg and she runs the Cree Dance and Theatre Center and puts out 5 magazines and volunteers at the Winnipeg Symphony, that's very nice and it sort of makes the point, but what we want to hear in that case is that no amount of information about Aboriginals as a group tells you anything about this particular Aboriginal walking down the street towards you right now. So it's not enough to focus on Aboriginal 1. You want it to become explicit that Aboriginal 1 is not the same as Aboriginal 2 to the end. So if you use a formula something like that, or if you use it without actually using it explicitly, in connection with an explanation of how some discourse that you're working on is an example or not of the use of the index, then you're pretty likely to avoid triviality. We can move on to the date. So the date. I've already said quite a bit about it. I talked about how the structural differential dates itself. I'll give you this quotation from Korzybski. He says that the date immediately abolishes the false stability that Aristotelian language assigns to things, events, etc. He says it places us in a physical, mathematical, space-time world of motion and change. Yet the investigation of the process can be arrested at any point for the purposes of analysis and communication. So, like fascism, for example. Say we're looking at fascism in Prussia. It has a long history. There would be nothing without that history. It contains its history. But, we got to start at some point, so we'll take the Franco-Prussian War. Okay, we'll take the Franco-Prussian War, we'll take Prussian militarism, we'll take First World War, we'll take the Treaty of Versailles, we'll take the mess and chaos after Versailles, we'll take the corruption and chaos of the Weimar Republic under Great Depression in the 30s. And then we've got the phenomenon we're looking at, so we can stop it there. Right? 1933, Hitler takes power. Now, in most studies of German fascism that you'll find, it starts in 1933 as if Hitler had an idea and it takes off from there. As if it had no history. So when you're using the date, you want to track down and attack ahistorical statements. Statements that are ahistorical, that talk as if the thing has no history, as if it doesn't contain its history. But Korzybski says, hey, you can stop it for the purposes of study there. 1933. Okay, so if you're writing, say, a PhD thesis on the rise of fascism, maybe you could take a 20-page introduction back to the Franco-Prussian War and start chapter 1 in 1933. But if you just started in 1933 without any attention to the history, then your supervisor should slap your wrist. So that's an example of one particular kind of use of the date, but there's also a kind of opposite. Let's say 1943. Now this is very, very, very common in discussions of National Socialism, the Holocaust, and Hitler, and all that kind of stuff. You take Nazism in 1943, when they were on the ropes, when they were losing the war, when the final solution was really getting going, when they were like freaking out, when the extremes of their ideology had come to a sharp point. And you talk about Nazism as though Nazism is the same as Nazism in 1943. It's not the same. A lot has happened in these 10 years, and Nazism in 1933, at the moment that Hitler took power, was a much more complex and variegated phenomenon. And in 1933, no one could have predicted what things are going to be like in 1943. So do you see the way the use of the date is double-edged? We want to avoid presentism. Some of you have heard that term. And you also want to avoid, well, that's the same as ahistoricism. It's not the same. It's like they're so closely related. Maybe they'll become clear with more examples. Maybe I should go up the abstraction level. Heraclitus once said you can't step into the same river twice. The date says you can't step into the same river once. Because as you were stepping in, you're no longer the same river. Of course, you are no longer the same either, but that's a scary thought. So. I told you early on about the elementary school teacher who put the apple on that table and the kids watched it go brown and rot. That's the use of the date. You see the whole process. The whole process is there. So if you talk about the apple as though it's just that nice shiny red thing that you can eat, that's like a presentism. But you can also go Apple, Tuesday, March the 5th, 1940, and study that out. You can pay attention to the, let's put it this way, historicity and instantaneity. And instantaneity. Okay. This here now is an instantaneity. The fact that this here now contains its entire past and perhaps in some sense also its future is historicism. So the discourse can err in either or both directions from the general semantics. I maybe should give some more examples. All right, here's a nice one. Let's go for the funny ones. Do you know what disabled people call us normal people or us non-disabled people? They call us temporarily able. Here's the use of the date. Two little words might do as much as hundreds marching in the streets and annoying passers-by. The rights of Englishmen, our constitutional rights, the values of our founding fathers, non-use of the date. Slavery? Slavery is bad. If slavery is so bad, we all know that now, how come not much more than 100 years ago, lots of good people thought that slavery was all right? I'm just raising a historical question. If you really want to understand slavery, then you have to understand how good people could own slaves good people, better than a lot of people today who don't own slaves. Good people could own slaves and give a lot of attention to taking good care of those slaves. Better care than many capitalists would take of their wage slaves. I mean, these are all the kinds of questions that can come up around the day. Is Roman Polanski 2010 responsible for the behavior of Roman Polanski in 1969? That's the question. Do you know that some people in Europe are calling for the chemical castration of Roman Polanski? Because wrong is wrong. And it stays wrong no matter how many hundreds of years elapse. I'm raising the whole problem here, I'm not solving it. What's called the statute of limitations. You know my fantasy of the International Court of Intertemporal Justice? The International Court of Intertemporal Justice. We've invented time travel. And now we can go back in the past. Haven't I told you about this yet? Now we can go back into the past, and under the rubric that no crime should go unpunished, we can go back into the past and punish all those criminals who got away with stuff, especially war criminals. And so we could bring Julius Caesar to The Hague, that kind of thing. You could be in the cell next to Slobodan Milosevic. And just, it's just a little problem. I'm not pretending to solve it. It could be put this way: do we judge past ages by their standards or by ours? Well, here's the truly scary thought. What if time travel is invented 200 years from now? And those bastards set up the Intertemporal Court of Justice and come back for us.
But what
We
if
don't
the-
even know what we're doing wrong, but ignorance of the law is no excuse. I should just, in very abstract terms, tell you a little bit here about Alfred North Whitehead's critique of what he calls simple location, or the fallacy of simple location. And since it's getting a bit hot in here, at least at the object level for me, maybe we can hazard opening up the door for you. The fallacy of simple location. This is pretty heavily philosophical lingo I'm going to come up with now, but if you can get it, you'll find it helpful, and if you don't get it today, don't worry about it. Whitehead and Korzybski criticized classical or Aristotelian science, and it's still subject to this kind of criticism in large part, for being elementalistic. That is, are natural science and social sciences that imitate natural science. Take nature as consisting of freestanding bits, in Kant's matter and motion, freestanding bits of self-existing substance that are simply located here and now. This is what I've been calling presentism. Just here and now, as if it's simply located here and now, without having any essential reference to either past or future. Without having any essential reference to either past or future. As if it somehow could exist apart from its past and apart from its future, right here now. So that things, this is just another way of talking about things, which I've already put in quotes, as if things could exist substantially outside of change, so that this makes it clear, as if whatever, let X stand for whatever, as if whatever could have things happen to it, or for it, as if change could happen to it, as if it could go through change without it essentially being any different at any point in space-time. So it's the idea we have of ourselves, too. It's like, I go through changes. I can recognize that. I can hardly avoid it. But what one is challenged to do here in the non-A perspective is to add something like this, I am change. So if I say Polanski is a process, or Horowitz is a process, it's not some Polanski that is going through change, or it's not some change that is happening to Polanski. Polanski himself is change. As if the lapse of time is an accident rather than of the essence of the material. So that's Whitehead's version of the critique of simple location. I think what we need here is maybe another few examples. Here's an example. I'll try and rush through it. I'm talking about you, Igor, and I'm saying to you, Igor, I don't know you, Igor, as well as I hope to know you a year from now. Compare that to me saying, I don't know the Igor that I hope to know a year from now. The first statement, I don't know you, Igor, as well as I hope to know you a year from now, implies that you, Igor, will remain the same. So there is a you, Igor, and I will know this Igor better a year from now. But wait, the Igor that I know a year from now is not this Igor. Right? Because both he and I will have been changed. So the non-Aristotelian way of putting it would be to say, I don't know the Igor that I hope to know a year from now. There is no, in other words, essential you underneath all the changes that you go through. As if I spend a lot of time with you, I'll discover the real you underneath the changes. Because there is no real you underneath the changes. So I'll get to know you now, and I'll get to know you a year from now, and I'll get to know you 10 years from now, and they're all different yous. And they have a history. And I can remember past yous. But there's no simple, elemental, unchanging you that goes through these changes. Of course, you could say there's parts of self that change a lot faster than other parts of self. That's for sure. For example, the loss of hair is amazingly rapid once it starts. The date, same kind of task. Find 5 examples of the use or non-use of the date. Avoiding both, how did I put it? Avoiding both presentism and, going for both instantaneity where appropriate and for historicity where appropriate. Remember the dog or the kid who asked mother, is that the same dog as when we passed on the way to the store? She says, no, it's not the same dog, but it's awfully similar. She's got both in there very nicely. The similarity covers the historicity which this dog contains. It contains its past history. But she's saying it's not the same dog. It's awfully similar. All right, so here's the, let's hand this out. I'll take you through this quickly. I'll give you both of these tasks. So here's the hints about date. I'll take you through this. Now you've got it to look at later, so I'm hoping it's clear enough so that if I read through it at a nice deliberate speed right now. If the statement would be more sane, null means sane. The statement would be more sane if it were specifically located in history rather than being unhistorically stated, given a date. Example. Science says that ulcers are caused by stress. Oh, isn't that nice? Actually, that's a non-use of the date, as if science had no history. The day before yesterday, science said that ulcers were caused by stress. So you know, science before 1990 said that ulcers are caused by stress, but since 1990, science has been saying that it's caused by a bacterium. And you still know the name of it,
Helicobacter pylori.
So maybe stress still plays a role, and who cares? We're just looking for examples of the use or non-use of the date. Okay? So, Two, if a statement would be more sane if it were not specifically located in time, i.e. not stated as though the thing could be only today, kind of a date in reverse. I don't use that expression, date in reverse anymore, so you can rub it out. How many times have you heard people say, young people today, or our society today, or businessmen today, or democracy today is in really, really serious trouble? But you see, they've been saying it as long as I've been alive. So that's an example of the other kind of non-use of the date. So you could date it like this. Yes, in our society today, adolescence has become a problem, and it has been a problem for many decades. And a third example, a statement that freezes a historical figure at one moment in time. I give an example here of Malcolm X and Pierre Trudeau, but Martin Luther King is a good example because Martin Luther King has become a saint, and whenever anyone mentions Martin Luther King down there, they go, oh yes, the day when a man will be judged by the content of his character, rather than by the color of his skin, as if that's all there was to Martin Luther King, as if he hadn't said all kinds of stuff before that, and especially as if he hadn't said all kinds of stuff after that. For example, that Martin Luther King became increasingly critical of war and capitalism up until the day that he was assassinated, and maybe the fact that he was getting more and more critical of war and capitalism had something to do with the fact that he was assassinated. I don't know. All that's left of King in our discourse is this liberal. Right? This goody-goody, everybody hates racism, liberal. So that's an example of the non-use of the date in the sense of expunging the history of Martin Luther King. We've got another example there in terms of especially Malcolm X and of Trudeau. I knew 2 or 3 Trudeaus myself. They all had the most amazing blue eyes. That's about all they had in common.